All right, thanks Kendrick. Ready to go. My title is Vision as Transformation of Representational Geometry. So the symposium questions are what I'm currently doing. What's the most critical question? I think it's how are high-level visual representations computed from retinal images? So that's quite similar to some of the other speakers. And to address this question, what is the most important thing that we need more of? I think it's direct tests of many candidate object vision models with brain activity data. So important points there, many different models. We have kind of a culture where often we like one particular model and then we test just that one model, and if we find a significant correlation or a significant amount of variance explained, then we're kind of happy with it. But what we need is model comparisons, I think. So the central concept that drives my approach to all this is the concept of representational geometry. And by representational geometry, I mean the geometry of the points in a high-dimensional response pattern space that correspond to the particular stimuli. So if you have illustrated that for a little toy space with 3 neurons, so we can think of the stimuli as points in this space, and everyone's familiar with this kind of idea. And so the key idea is that what matters here is the distances between these points. So if we had another representation where we have the same distances, so you see this ensemble has just been rotated, now all the neurons are doing different things. They're sharing the job of representing these stimuli differently, but I'd argue that's not a very interesting difference, because a rotation is just a linear transformation. It's computationally trivial, and we shouldn't care about it at all, right? So it's useful and it simplifies things a lot to just abstract from that and compute the distances between these, and that's the approach that we take. So this leads to something I call the representational similarity trick. So we have a number of stimuli. We present them to brains of humans and monkeys and to models as well. And then in a given region of interest that we want to understand, we get an activity pattern for each particular stimulus in a brain and in the model, right? So now we want to test the model, so we need to somehow compare the model representation to the brain representation, right? At the level of these response patterns, that's very difficult. And why is it difficult? Because we don't know the point-to-point mapping between the model units and the brain measurement channels, which could be single neuron recordings or voxels. And this is actually a very difficult problem because there are many of these, right? So this is going to be a subsample of millions of neurons, either averaged together in some complicated way or selected extremely sparsely. And these are units that don't match these in number, and there's also a large number of them, right? So now this very trivial problem here has so many parameters that we're kind of wasting a lot of data on just fitting that stage. Right? So our approach therefore is to go one level up, compute the representational distance matrices, or RDMs, and at this level then everything becomes very easy because these matrices are indexed by our stimuli, so then we could just compare them directly, and if they look similar, then we say that the representations are similar. So here's a result that's been haunting me for the last 6 years or so. It's from 2008, where we did this in humans and monkeys, and we did this for a set of 92 different images, which you see lined up here. Half of them were animate, half were inanimate, and there are bodies and faces of humans and animals here. And you see that these matrices are strikingly similar, and they both show this strong categorical structure where all the animates cluster together, all the inanimates cluster together, the human faces, the animal faces, and also actually human and animal faces form a single cluster, and that's strikingly similar between these. And even within the categories, there's a lot of similarity here to the geometry. So this was surprising, especially because this was a matrix matrix estimated from fMRI voxels, 2 millimeters cubed, and this was based on cell recordings performed by Rusbe-Kiani, 670 something cell recordings. So it was very surprising to us that despite this very different form of measurement, we get quite similar characterizations of the representational geometry. So on the one hand, it's encouraging that we seem to get something similar. On the other hand, it's puzzling, and we should perhaps not rely on it, and we should try to understand why it was the case in this case, and when we can expect the geometries to be well matched between cell recordings and fMRI. So one mathematical insight that's relevant in this context is that random projections preserve geometry. So when we have p points in an m-dimensional space and then we project them down onto m random dimensions, then there's this, and this could be the neuronal population, this could be the ideal measured channels. There's this lemma that says that if we have m greater than O of log p random projections, then with high probability we'll only get a very small distortion in the representational distance matrix. So now voxels or recordings are not random projections, but I still think that perhaps they're close enough to make these geometries similar. So this result raised many questions. I'll just highlight 3 of them. How does the representation dynamically emerge over time? How is it computed from images? And how is it related to behavior? And I want to speak briefly about all of them, but I'm going to focus on 2, number 2, and on 1 and 3, I'm mainly going to share my excitement about some current developments and point you to some talks and posters at VSS as well. So how does the representation dynamically emerge? Last year, Tom Carlson published a paper that took this representational similarity approach to MEG. So this is representational dynamics with MEG RSA. Tom Carlson has pioneered some of the MEG decoding work earlier, and then he did this, and I'm really excited about this. It allows us, here's an example from another study by Radek Kishi, who I wasn't involved in this at all. It was with Oliver at MIT, and I want to show you this just because it's so exciting to me, that you can look at the RDM as a movie based on these MEG data. So this is the RDM 100 milliseconds before stimulus onset. This is a multidimensional scaling arrangement of the stimuli, that kind of sort of visualization of the representational geometry with these colors coding for the different objects. Let's see if this works. So you see this running, the stimulus comes on now, and first everything is different from everything else. Then there's this tight face cluster here, then this human face cluster, then there's an animal face cluster, then all the faces start clustering together here, and the inanimates also start forming a cluster. And now the stimulus is still on, it's 500 milliseconds. And then once the stimulus is off, there's still a lot of structure that kind of persists in the representation. And I find it very exciting to see this dynamic emergence of different aspects of the representational geometry. So MEG gives us temporal but not spatial detail. And fMRI gives us spatial but not temporal detail. And what Radek has done in this study is combine the two by simply correlating these fMRI representational distance matrices for V1 and IT with the MEG RDM movie across time. So then you get these time courses of these components of the distance matrix as they emerge. So for V1, it's sort of a very early component in the MEG RDM movie, and for IT, it peaks a little bit later, then it goes down again, then it comes up, and then it stays up, it's quite sustained, and then it slowly fades. So these studies begin to show how this is not really a process where the geometry just emerges with all the distances sort of being scaled up together, but different categorical divisions come online one by one, and I find that quite exciting. There's also work at VSS on this, where Tom Carlson is taking this to the next level using these Gabor configurations, for which we have very strong predictions from simple low-level V1 type models, as you've heard about in some of the earlier talks. But these also have a lot of global structure. There's spirals in there, patch swap spirals, radial and concentric patterns, random patterns. So we have these interesting predictions there from computational models, and we also had subjects do similarity judgments, and perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not surprisingly, the model that sort of beats everything else is how different these look subjectively to us. So that brings back sort of the question, you know, to what extent we're computationally in a position to let go of, you know, what things look like. I think we want to, but it's going to be a while till we can. So the second question, how is the IT representation computed from images? With my graduate student Khaled Rotsavi, we looked at a range of models, and they were sort of ranging from brain theory models that were neuroscientifically motivated to computer vision models and just simple representations. I don't want to name them all. There's many of the sort of favorite features of computer vision, such as SIFT and GIST and fog were among them. These were all untrained. We also had some trained models that were trained with unsupervised methods on natural images, but not on the images that we used in the study. And there were also a couple of weakly supervised models in our set of models. So altogether it was 28 different models. And what we found was that while almost all of these models explain significant variance, so they explain some component of the representational geometry, none of them really reaches this noise ceiling which we compute to estimate how much replicable structure there is in our data that the models do not explain. So the model that worked best was this combination of all models where we combined features from all the other models. So that's consistent with some earlier results in computer vision, that these also tend to perform well at object recognition, but it doesn't quite reach this ceiling. So here are some examples, some of the best fitting representational geometries. Here's human IT for human IT, and what we see here is many of them get this human face cluster, but what they're really missing is this major division between animates and inanimates and some of the other sort of sharp categorical distinctions. Here's the same thing for monkey IT, where some of the models are the same, some change, the order changes slightly. So next we went and tried to test a very recent model, which is a deep supervised convolutional network. This is sort of the state of the art in computer vision object recognition, and there have been exciting advances since in 2006 also. Jeff Hinton, Joshua Bengio, and others have found ways to really train with supervision very deep neural network models. So neural networks were sort of hip in the 80s, and then they ran out of steam a little bit, and a reason for that was that we weren't actually able to train very complex neural network models with lots of layers, and it turns out that this is exactly what you need. You need lots of layers to efficiently represent the kinds of complex functions that are required for object recognition. So this network won the ImageNet competition recently, and it's publicly available, so we just downloaded it and compared its internal representations to our data. So this is a supervised model. It's supervised with 1.2 million category labeled images, trained with stochastic gradient descent using dropout regularization. It's got lots of parameters. So the key difference to the other models is the strong supervision with millions of labeled images, right, that enables this model to get these category divisions that are really missing in the lower level computer vision features. So we tested this in the same way as the other models by looking at the accuracy of human IT dissimilarity matrix prediction. So this is Kandel's tau. It's essentially correlating these representational distance matrices. So let's start with layer 1. In layer 1 we see a very low correlation. It's a significant correlation, right? So if we only had this one model, we could write a paper and say, so it explains a little bit of variance, it's significant, but that's not really very interesting, right? We can look at the variability of this fit when we bootstrap resample the stimulus set, and I think that's a thing that's good to do because it gives us a sense of how dependent our results are on our sample of stimuli. In many vision studies, we treat our stimuli as fixed effects. We don't look at the variability across stimuli. So the other important thing is that we have a noise ceiling here, and this model is very far from this noise ceiling. So the top of the noise ceiling is the highest accuracy that any model can achieve, and the bottom is other subjects' average as a model, because we can't really expect a model to predict a given subject better than sort of the average of all other subjects if we had enough of them, right? So that gives us a lower bound on the noise ceiling. So when we go up these layers, we get closer and closer to the representational geometry in IT. And the layers 6 and 7 of the model, which are fully connected, come really close, but they don't really quite hit it yet. And the reason they don't is because even though they emphasize some of the categorical divisions quite strongly, they don't emphasize exactly the right categorical divisions. So what we did was we trained SVM discriminants on the basis of this already very well-formed object representation at the top layer of this model, and then we can reach into the noise ceiling here. And here this final version is a weighted combination of all the layers of the models and the SVM discriminants that best predicts IT, and this is based on independent images. And this performs significantly better than all of the other layers of the model. So when we just look at these matrices, we see that sort of for the first time we get something that just when we eyeball it looks very similar to what we see in human and monkey IT. So in the final 1 minute, I just want to mention briefly how we're looking at how the IT representation is related to behavior. There's some interesting recent work on that, predicting similarity judgments, comparing these representational geometries to similarity judgments in Moore et al. 2013. There's stuff at this year's VSS on visual search from Cohen et al. And George Alvarez and Talia Konkel and Ken Nakayama. And there's 2 talks on predicting categorization reaction time from representational geometries. And I just want to give you a taste of the first of these by Charest et al. In my lab. So the first study on this was again for Tom Carlson, where he looked at this representational geometry, fit an SVM linear classifier, and then projected all of these images onto this discriminant dimension, and then argued that if they're far away from the boundary, there might be a stronger signal for doing this categorization animate versus inanimate, and so subjects might be faster to respond. And he found that that's actually true, so there's this negative correlation between the absolute decision value and the reaction time. So in this year's VSS presentation, Jan Scharre is taking this one step further. So our basic assumption here is that the evidence accumulation rate is proportional to the decision value. And we're using this framework of kernels where X here is the representational pattern, and then we have these reference patterns C, which could be category centroids, or they could be support vectors, and then we compute these kernels, the kernel similarity measures between these reference patterns and the input patterns, and weight them in order to estimate the decision, in order to model the decision value. Now we can explore different kernels. If this is an inner product, this is a linear discriminant, as we've seen in the work of Carlson, or we can make this just a Euclidean distance, in which case this is a radial basis function, and you might have something like a one-class classifier that just does animate detection, perhaps, right? And we want to contrast these different models, try different kernels, and see how we can best predict the reaction times. We can also do this, and Jan has done this for representations in computational models, so not using the brain data, but the model. And here's just a taste of how well this works when we use the top layer of the deep convolutional network. You see that when the decision value is close to 0, so it's close to the boundary, we get these large reaction times, and then as we go away from the boundary, we get much faster reaction times. So that's just an advertisement for Jan's talk. That's all I have.